Thanks for tuning in. It is day number 4 here, and today we're going to be doing interacting with objects. So we're going to interact with these cubes. We're going to set it up so that we can build for both the cardboard for Google Play and the GearVR for the Oculus Store. And that's going to be done through the VR build settings here, where we can build GearVR and then it just builds for this. And we could build GoogleVR and it just works for this. And we're going to interact with objects. As you can see, we won't have a dot on the screen at all unless we look at a interactive object. Then the dot will appear. And we'll also look at getting the outline on the objects. So we get a real nice outline like this when we look at an interactive object. And we're also going to look at interacting with these objects based on distance. So this object, I can't interact with it at all because if I look at it in the inspector, it has an interaction distance of 1. I'm going to increase that to 3. And I'm going to try to interact with it again. I still can't because it's too far away. It's more than 3. If I bring it closer, there we go. Now I can interact with it. And it has the outline. We're going to get all that done right now. Here we go. Interaction is, of course, going to happen at the gaze or where the user is looking in mobile VR. An easy way to set this up is to go into the GoogleVR folder under the UI and drag the GVR reticle onto the main camera. And so it's a child now. If I play, I'll have the dot on the screen, but it doesn't interact with objects on the cube. If I were to add an event trigger, because it already has a box collider, then we should be able to interact with it. But before that will work, we will need to add a new object. And actually, if I just say create UI event system, that's what we want. And we need to add the gaze input module. And then to make everything work, the camera needs to have a physics raycaster. Now all of these objects, the physics raycaster, the gaze input module, they all have different names in Google VR version 1.10 and above, but remember, we're not using that. Sometimes it's better just to use stable versions. So we're using Google VR 1.03. The proper names on these things are gaze input module, physics raycaster. And so if I have a physics raycaster on the camera, we got the GVR dot prefab here. The cube has a box collider and an event trigger. Then we should get interaction. And so you can see when I look at the box, the dot turns into a circle, and when I move my mouse, it resets it. And the reason why is because the standalone input module has priority, and we need to move the gaze input module above the standalone input module. So we have basic input, and we could do something like go to the cube and say add new event type and say pointer down, and I'm just going to add a new event here, and for the object I just want to use the cube, and I'm going to say game object set active, and this is true and this is false. So set active, turns it on or off, so this is going to turn the cube off, and that's no good because that cube has baked lighting on it. So it's not a, stuff with baked lighting like that. It's okay to have a box collider so that if I'm walking around, I can't walk through it, but it shouldn't be an interactive object because it has, it has the baked lighting, and stuff that can move or stuff that turns on and off shouldn't have the baked lighting on them. Now this has the default shader, so I'm just going to go into the materials folder, and this, if it was a crate or something like that, it should have a material on it with probably a texture of a crate. But for now, I just want to use a brown color, and I could use something like mobile on lit, but that doesn't let me select the color, so I probably would have to go unlit color, and I can select a brown color here, and I'm going to apply that to this box. So some of the colors that shaders that are okay in mobile VR, your mobile shaders, not the bumped ones, but the diffuse shader and the vertex lit shaders, the unlit shaders. So the easy to render shaders. So this is we got our brown object, which is like our crate, or in this case it's our interactive object. And so in order to interact with that, I'm going to move it into level 1 first of all, and I'll call it interactive cube, and it's going to need to have the event trigger on it. One of the questions that a lot of people have asked me on the channel is, how do I have an object and then when I look at it, make it show some text? So what you could do is you could go to 3D text, and then I'm going to make this object 0.1.1.1 so the text doesn't look so bad, and I'm going to make it's at 0.00 as a child, so it's right in the middle. I'm going to move it 0.5 this way, so it's negative 0.5, so that it's kind of on the face. And then the text object itself, I'll say upper center and center. So now the text is kind of right there on the face of the box. And then by default, the text, I'm going to toggle it off. And then because it's an interactive cube, I'm going to say add a new event for pointer enter. And I'm going to add a new event for pointer exit. And we want a new action for each of those. And the object that we're going to be using is the text object. And again, we're just going to say game object set active true when you look at it, and game object set active false when you look away. And so by default, it's already turned off. And if I look at the cube, then we should get hello world. And if I look away, it should turn off. So that's just a quick, simple way to show some text on something when you look at it. Now, since the input system is all up and working, I'm going to go ahead and do a build and run on this, and we could just make sure that everything is working on Android platform and that the input works properly. When I look at the cube, yep, it says hello world and everything is working correctly. And now we're going to get into the GearVR, because it's if I'm building this project to work on GearVR, it's important to take care of that early on, so we know that, so that when we're at the end of the game, we don't have to go fix a bunch of stuff. We just want it to work from the beginning. And there's some ways to do this. I got the asset on the asset store for the GearVR, which is called the GoogleVR and GearVR camera setup, and this lets you easily switch between these two platforms. And I also have a tutorial on how to do that, and here it is right here. No, this isn't the one. How to make a cardboard and GearVR compatible camera in Unity. Okay, so look at this video if you want to learn how to make that yourself. It's a little bit outdated, and I keep the project right here on the asset store updated. So this is the updated version, but it's easier to keep this updated than to always go make a new tutorial every time Google releases a new update to the SDK. So this one's kept up to date. And so we're going to be using that, but essentially to build for GoogleVR manually, we would disable a VR mode, and that gives us a full screen camera. And the full screen camera like this is what you need for the GearVR, except you got to go to the build settings and you got to have the virtual reality supported turned on. And because the build target is Android, it's going to build that for Oculus. Now, the other thing we need to do to build is to go to the plugins folder and the Android folder. We're going to have to create a folder here called assets, and in the assets folder, we need to bring in our Oculus signature file. So the Oculus signature file comes from Oculus's website right here. And so you can put your device ID in and get that file. And now we're ready to build because the VR mode is turned off and virtual reality supported is turned on. Then we could say build and run this. And this build is going to be a GearVR build. And we're going to have a problem with this build to where we look at the cube and it doesn't show hello world. And the reason why is because when we turned on virtual reality mode, it has switched the way the raycast is, where the raycast is shooting from. And so we're going to have to edit the gaze input module to fix that. Yep, so exactly that is happening. I'm looking at the cube and nothing is happening. We're going to have to edit the gaze input module to account for when Unity's virtual reality supported mode is enabled. So we're going to need to go to the gaze input module. That's what we added to the event system. So if we type gaze input module in right here and double click on it, we'll open it up to edit it with .NET. So the problem is, and I'm going to open up my script on the other screen over here to help me out. But essentially, this is what we need to do. We need a new public variable, and it's going to be called public bool Unity VR mode enabled. And we're also going to need a private variable, which is a vector2, and we'll call this center of screen. A vector2 center of screen, and a public bool for the Unity VR mode enabled. And I'm not worried about the indenting because Google's scripts are indented small. Okay, so now that we have those two bools, or the two variables defined, we need to also have a function after the variables here, and it looks like click time is the last one before the functions begin. So here I want to have a void start. Okay, so got it fixed up, and the correct way to type this is protected override void start. I'm just going to paste a little bit of code and we'll edit it. So if the Unity VR mode enabled is true, the center of screen is going to be the VR settings eye texture width. So first of all, we're going to have to go to the top of the script, and we're going to have to include the Unity engine.vr, and that should take care of those errors. And then otherwise you're using the Cardboard or GoogleVR SDK, and hotspot doesn't exist anymore, so we need to replace hotspot with something. And so I'm going to show you what that is. If you go to the cast ray from gaze function, and where it says the pointer data position is equal to get gaze pointer position, which is a vector2, and I can see that function is at the bottom of the script right here, and I'm going to cut it out because it needs to be deleted. It doesn't get used. Because instead of getting a vector2 via a function, we're going to define it at start. And so I'm going to paste that function right here, and we're just going to sabotage a little bit of it and then delete the rest. Make sure we're doing everything right. Now, we don't need this, because we don't need those two lines because they're just getting in the way. So what happens here is there's a vector 2 and it's set to the screen width and height normally, and then it's divided by 0.5. So the screen width and height is here, and the 0.5 would be the hot spot, so we're just going to say 0.5 F. It's always going to be 0.5 because that's going to be the middle of the screen. So that should be okay, and then so we're setting it to screen width and height. We're doing 0.5, except here I'm dividing by 2, and here it's multiplying by 0.5, and that's kind of annoying. So we're just gonna change that to so they both divide by 2, get the full height, and then divide by 2 so that we go right to the middle of the screen. And it was using the VR settings eye texture width. That's what we're already using. So I know we're good with that. So that was kind of messy, but what just happened was we deleted the function that returns a vector 2, and instead we're defining a vector 2 at start, and it's being saved into center of screen. So where this error is right here, because it can't find this function anymore, we just need to say that that is the center of the screen. So now the center of the screen is set correctly. If this bool Unity VR mode is set. Now that bool is going to show up on the script now right here, Unity VR mode enabled, and what I mean by that, Unity VR mode enabled, is this checkbox checked? So if Unity VR mode is enabled, then it needs to put the center of the screen to this VR setting. And if Unity VR mode is turned off, it just needs to use the center of screen. So on the Unity VR mode, we would, on the event system, we're going to have to set this manually or program a way to do that. Now just to test it out, I'm going to say Unity VR mode is enabled because it is, and I'm going to build and run, and I'm going to make sure that that fixes the problem where the raycast wasn't in the center of the screen. Okay, back on the GearVR, and it's loaded up, and if I look at the cube, it says hello world, and the circle expands. So I know that the fix to the gaze input module is working, and we can go ahead and continue now. It's gonna be, you know, kind of up to you how you turn this bool on or off. I'm going to take care of it right now through a button up here where I switch between GoogleVR and GearVR. And to get that really easily, I'm just going to import this package. Now, I don't need the demo or the documentation or the prefab. I just want the script. And this pack has a option to use custom defines, and I'm going to turn that off because I will use, if I want to use custom defines, I'll probably use my custom define manager. And so this tool gives you this asset gives you a build GearVR, build GoogleVR button, and there's also this VR build option just selects this for you, which is, there's only one option in there right now. And then there's another thing here, update selected prefab in all scenes. That's for if you have a main camera and a GVR viewer main in every single scene, and that would be in a case where you're not using additive scenes. So I don't need this option. And I'm not using custom defined, so I really don't need this option either. So long story short, I'm gonna really edit my script because all of this checking the custom defines, which is what it's doing right there, is checking to see if I have the GoogleVR SDK imported to give you a nice error if you don't. And I don't need to worry about that. And I don't need the update selected prefab in all scenes button. That's what this is. And I don't need the custom defined management because I have a better tool for that, custom defined manager. Now I don't have to delete these. I already toggled off the function. But to make this script a little bit more clear to see what's going on, I'm going to cut out all of the stuff that's not necessary. We don't need that button anymore. And so we're just left with the two buttons, which is GoogleVR and the Build GearVR button. Now I am having an error here on line 39 and 65. This update custom defines, those two lines need to get deleted, and there, it does it again right here. So now that all should be left is going to be the two buttons: Build VR settings, Build GearVR, and Build GoogleVR. And if I try to switch to the Build GearVR, it says GVR head could not be found. Ensure the GVR head script is added to the main camera. So that just means I need to go to the main camera and add the GVR head. And so now if I clear my errors, I should be able to switch to GearVR and switch to GoogleVR. And it updates all the settings I need between those two, like setting the VR mode enabled on and off. VR mode enabled for GearVR, it's turned off, and for GoogleVR, it's turned on. And that also updates all the proper settings, like the virtual reality supported button here. So if I say Build GearVR, that should turn on. And if I go to GoogleVR, it should turn it off. Perfect. And that's happening in this script here. And this is all this is because I need to set on the gaze input module this public bool, the public bool Unity VR mode enabled. So when you click on the Build GearVR, we're gonna say gaze input module gaze input is equal to game object dot get dot find object of type. And I know there's only one object out there that is a gaze input module, so it's going to find the right one, and we are going to say gaze input module dot VR Unity VR mode enabled is equal to true when you click on Build GearVR, and when you click on Build GoogleVR, that's going to be false. So I know when I click on Build Settings GearVR, Unity VR mode enabled should be on, and when I click VR Build Settings GoogleVR, it should turn off, so that the raycast works properly no matter which build target I choose here. Now when I'm developing, I like to keep this on GoogleVR because then my raycast is going to work. Because you'll notice if I go to GearVR and I run, for one, I can't rotate my head anymore, but if I were to rotate the camera over there, it doesn't highlight anymore. So while you're testing, you need to, on Unity Editor, you need to keep it on the GoogleVR mode. And sometimes I get sick of the split screen because it's too small to see stuff. So sometimes what I do is have it on GoogleVR mode, and then when I'm testing it, I'll just toggle this real quick so that I got a full screen picture to kind of look at stuff, and the interaction still works. So then if I hit this build GoogleVR, it's going to fix that for me. It's going to toggle that, and I can do my build and run for GoogleVR. So I know everything is working between the build the GearVR, and when I click build GoogleVR, it builds me a GoogleVR app, and the input works the same. Everything's perfect. And when I get to the end of the game, it still works between the two platforms. Even though I should be testing it, you know, at least maybe every few days between, make sure that it still works on the GearVR. Now, that covers input and the getting all this stuff working. So the next part of this I'm gonna go through kind of quickly because it's a lot of work, and it's stuff I've already done, and each little piece of this would be a really long tutorial. So I'm going to import a Unity package that I already have. And let's just take a quick look at what we're getting. We're getting a prefab, a material, interactive object script, an outline shader, an outline material, VR dot script, and a VR dot shader. And the reason why there's a resources folder with a materials folder inside of that, here it is, with an outline only script, or with an outline only material, is because this material is going to be used at runtime. And in order for you to use a resource at runtime, it has to be in a folder that's named resources. And this outline shader and material, the shader's in the other folder here, it's right here, but the shader and this material draws an outline on an object, and that's it. So I'm going to Control Z to undo that, and you'll see what we're going to do with this in just a minute. But we got this, and what it is going to do is it works like this. It's a duplicate. It's duplicated and edited it. The Google's shader and script for the GearVR dot here, and it's always on the screen, and I didn't like that. I don't want it to be on the screen. I just want it to show up when I look at something. So what I'm going to do is delete the GearVR dot prefab that has the GearVR dot script on it, and I'm going to use this other one that I've made that has more options on it, and it has a different modified shader on it. And the reason why is because when I look around in VR, I don't want there to be any intrusive UI on the screen at all times. I just want there to be some cursor when I'm looking at interactive objects. So you'll see when I look at the object, that's when the dot shows up. It's not the circle shape, it's just the dot, and it disappears and has a nice shrinking and growing effect between looking at an interactive object and looking away, just like the circle does. But it disappears when you're not looking at an interactive object, and it shows up when you're looking at it. Now, this dot looks okay right now, but I know in VR this is really big, and it needs to be smaller. So I'm going to make it like a 1, and now it's just a very small dot, and that actually is pretty good sized in VR, and it looks like a good sized cursor for your VR game. So we have that, and then I'm also going to add we've already added the event trigger. Now I'm going to get rid of the text, and I'm going to get rid of the event trigger. So this cube is not interactive anymore because it doesn't have the event trigger on it. And there's a script here that I've written, and it's called interactive object. And we're going to add interactive object onto the cube. And so here it is, interactive object. It lets me turn interactive interaction on or off. So maybe in the game you can't interact with that object yet. So you can toggle interaction on or off. There's a distance and how far away you're allowed to interact with this object. There's a max gaze time, which is how long you look at it before the button gets triggered. Because this script works both by clicking the button and by looking at it, and the max gaze time is how long you look at it before that button gets clicked. And then there's an outline, some outline settings, and it's the interactive cube, and I'm looking at cube. That's the one that's over. That's the one that's over here. Okay, interactive cube. And I have probably added the interactive object to the wrong object. Okay, we're back on interactive cube, and this is the one that's getting interactive objects. Now when I hit play, my script here is gonna automatically add the event trigger that it needs for interaction. So you'll see it interacts, but the outline is red and it's really small. So for one, I'm gonna change the color of the outline, and just to make it something that's easily visible, we'll do this cyan color. And the interactive cube has a outline width. I'm going to move this up a ways, and we'll hit play, and let's see what happens when we look at the cube. All right, we get a nice blue outline on it. I'm going to move the cube a little bit closer to the player here. So it should be easier to see. So when we look at an object, the outline appears, and we get a dot on the screen to show kind of when we're going to get to the edge of the object. Now, let me open this up. I can't go through the whole entire script because it's really big, and it has the tool tips and everything, so it's basically ready for distributing to the asset store. So if you think this is something that it would be helpful, let me know, and I can get the whole thing in a package, because you can see that it's kind of more than all the stuff that's happening here with the dot and the outline, and there's a lot of stuff going on, and it's a little bit more than I can throw into a tutorial easily. But the asset store is good for packs like this. So there's variables. We've already covered the distance, the outline. Now there's the other private variables here, and you can always pause the video and type this thing out. So, and then when it starts, it tries to find an event trigger, and if it doesn't find one, then it makes one. And then when it updates, it does this stuff for the outline, and when you're looking at it, it executes a pointer down, so it clicks a button. And I've recently added a tutorial on how to do this exact thing. So anyways, all this is doing is if you look at an object for too long, it'll do a click on it. And then there's the events here for the pointer enter and the pointer exit, and just some custom things. Spawn the outline child. Okay, so long story short, it's a pretty big script, and the thing that is not working yet on it is the distance. And that's why, it's more than just this script, because we're going to get into the gaze input module again here, unfortunately. And the gaze input module is what's going to be looking at the distance variable here. So we already have the gaze input module opened up. It's right here. And we have this script where we have defined the distance variable. And we're back here now. I see the Unity VR mode enabled. that is handled by my other scripts, and I'm never going to need to bother with that. So I'm just going to say hide in inspector, so that back in the inspector on the event system, this goes away. There it goes. So the gaze input model looks like normal again, and even though it's a public variable, because it needs to be public for my other editor script to access it. So to get this to modify the gaze input module so it looks at the distance, we're going to scroll down here to about line 130 is where I'm at right now, and I'm on the process function. And there's three things that happen in process. Cast ray from gaze, that's this function. And then there's update current object, which is the next function right here. Update current object. And then after that it says update dot. And so again, I'm going to line 130. And I'm looking at my process function, and it says cast ray from gaze, update current object, update dot. And I want to interrupt this process depending on distance. I don't know if this is the best way to do it, but I thought that totally eliminating the object from the gaze input system whatsoever, if it's outside of distance, is an okay way to go. So this is how it works. We're going to cast the ray from gaze, and the indentation is wrong here, and that's going to drive me crazy. So I'm going to just shift tab and tab. Okay. So it's going to save the previous game object. It's going to cast the ray from the gaze, and then after that, we're going to get a new game object. And that's going to be game object at gaze. Game object at gaze is equal to pointer data dot pointer current raycast dot game object. So if there is a game object at the gaze, then let's try to find the interactive object script. Say game object at gaze dot get component interactive object, and if there is an interactive object script, let's debug.log interactive object script. And to test this out to see if it's going to work, we should have a cube that has an interactive object script, and we should have a cube that doesn't have an interactive object script. And if I look at the cube on the right, nothing should happen in the console. Well, in order to make this work, they should have an event system. I can also add the event system, the event trigger, to the interactive object if I want to. That way I can add my own events. So they both got event triggers, but this one has the interactive object script. So when I look at the one on the right, nothing should happen in the console. It should respond to the dot. But when I look at the one on the left, it says it has an interactive object script over and over and over again. So if it has an interactive object script, we're going to need to check the distance variable here. So we're going to say if vector3.distance, and we want to do the distance between the game object at the gaze transform position and camera main transform position. So if the distance between that is less than or equal to the interactive object script distance variable. So let's get the distance between the interactive object and the camera. And if that's less than or equal to the interactive object script distance, which is set right here, then we want to allow interaction. And by allow interaction, that means update current object and update the dot. The problem with that as is it's not going to work with anything else like this, even though it has an event trigger. And when I look away, it's still going to show the outline because the only time the dot gets updated is when you're looking right at an object with an interactive object script. So we need to add a few else statements in here. This else covers if you're looking at an object and it has an interactive object script, but the distance is too short. And if that's the case, we want to do handle pointer enter and exit, and we're going to pass into that pointer data null. And we're going to do pointer data is equal to new pointer event data event system. And we will want to update the dot after that. Now the other else statement that we're going to do is if we are looking at an interactive object that does not have or we're looking at a game object that has a collider and event system, but it doesn't have an interactive object script on it. And if that's the case, then we'll just process normally. And by process normally, I mean process cast ray from gaze, update current object, update dot. So that's what's happening if you look at an object with an interactive object script and you're within distance. And that's what's happening when you look at an object that does not have an interactive object script on it. And the last else statement is going to be for if there's not a game object at the gaze, we want to process normally, because I'll show you why again real quick. If I look at this cube and then I look straight up, the border is going to stay there because there's no game object at gaze. So if there's no game object at gaze, we're going to need to do a normal process, which is cast ray from gaze, update current object, update dot. So now with all the exceptions handled, let's test the distance out. So first of all, we got something that doesn't have it has an event trigger and it has a box collider. So it should get a dot on it, but this object won't get an outline because it doesn't have the interactive object script. Now this one is going to get the outline, and it has a distance of 5. So let me make another one. And this one's going to have a distance of 1. And so let's see what happens. The one on the far right, we should have just a dot and that's it, and nothing happens except the dot appears on it. This one should have the outline and the dot. This one doesn't do anything at all, and it's not being processed by the event system because it's too far away. It only has a distance of 1. So if I were to bring it closer to the camera, it's still not close enough. And I think 1 is really too close. You gotta have at least 2 on there. There we go. 1 is almost gonna be right in your face. So with a distance of 2, I can select it. And if I move it away and it gets to a distance of 2, I won't be able to interact with that one anymore. So I have my distance working, I have my outline working, I have my dot on the screen working that disappears if I'm not looking at stuff. That way if I'm looking like this, I can just enjoy the pretty view without an intrusive UI dot on the screen at all times. And so this was quite a bit of work. Let me know if you think that a pack like this would be handy. I just don't know the best way to package it up. It's going to be a VR interaction pack, and so that would include the outline and the dot, the dot that only appears when you're looking at objects. So you could pick between that or the one that comes with Google, or if your objects want to have an outline, and what color the outline is. So if you think that pack would be handy, let me know, because like I said, in order for me to do the tutorial on all this, it would turn into like 5 more days, and we'd be like, day 1 shader this, day 2 outline shader, and day 3 interactive object strip. Because just think about going through a tutorial like this where I write this script. That's going to be awful. So I think a Unity pack would be the best way. All right, thanks for watching. This is gonna wrap up day number 4, and we have interaction with objects. So we're working on the GearVR. We're working on the GoogleVR. We easily switch between those. So I think we're almost at a spot where we could begin making a project. I might want to, select everything in this and say export package and make a Unity package out of it and say this is my base VR project. So in the future, when I make VR games, I could just open this up, import this, and I have all my lighting settings set up. I got all the settings, all the work we've done for the past 4 days is basically just getting the basics set up so we can start making a game. So I think tomorrow we might get into actual something more exciting. I don't know. We'll see. Thanks for watching. See you guys tomorrow.